Star Wars Legacy by Madeline Rue was released about a week ago, July 28th. I picked it up, finished reading it in about a little under a week, and I'm here today to give my first reading impressions of it. As always, there's not going to be any major spoilers here. This is a spoiler-free review. The only things I'll talk about in regards to the plot is just anything you need to know for the setup of the book, and maybe a little bit of the character backgrounds when I talk about the characters and my thoughts on them. But again, no major spoilers here. This book takes place in between episodes 8 and 9, and basically show how Rey and Leia come to have the relationship they do in Rise of Skywalker, the master-apprentice relationship they've kind of developed into. This book is the explanation of how that happens. I was very excited for this one when I heard about it. The sequel era is in desperate need of more material around it, more books, comics, games, anything. The sequel era just needs more stories to help flesh it out. And the time period between episodes 8 and 9 is perfect for a book like this, to have a tie-in book to help answer some of those questions and make connections and just kind of flow us into the Rise of Skywalker better. I like Star Wars books that do that, so I was very excited to see how this one was going to go. Let's start with the setup. So as I mentioned, this book takes place in between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. It's about Rey trying to figure out how she can heal the Kyber crystal that was destroyed in her fight with Kylo Ren at the end of The Last Jedi. So she wants to heal it and repair the lightsaber. She finds some records of a Jedi forge on the planet Tython and figures that's the perfect place to go to see if she can figure out how to fix this lightsaber. And Leia goes with her. That's half the story. The other half of the book involves this First Order major officer. Her name is Brilla Wolstenholme. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But she is basically someone who has survived an attack against her. It's kind of left her scarred, and she's trying to find the perpetrators. Those perpetrators, mainly a character named Gav. He also ends up on Tython with Rey, and basically this brings all of them on a potential collision course with each other. All right, so now let me talk about my thoughts on the plot itself. Again, no spoilers here. This is not, I think it's important to talk about what this book is not. This is not a Rey and Leia going on adventures as master and apprentice, getting into trouble, planet hopping, getting into battles together. That's not what this book is. This is a much more personal story. One that takes its time and it really explores what's going on with Rey, what's going on with Leia, and how they end up forging a relationship together. That's really the crux of what this book is about. I think it's important to go into this book knowing that. This is a much more personal story. It takes its time. It really explores Rey and Leia and how they forge the relationship with each other, how they each deal with inner demons. And I think it's important to know that going into this book, that that's really the type of story the author wants to tell here. Let me start with Rey and Leia's half of the story, and then I'll talk about Officer Brilla's side of the story afterwards. So when it comes to the Rey and Leia side of things, my first thoughts were honestly that the story it moved a little too slow for my liking. There's a lot of the characters just kind of meandering around, talking with each other, working through thoughts. Like I said, this book does take its time when it comes to that. But I sat with it for a couple days after finishing it. I watched the author's interview with Star Wars Explained. I like to get the author's perspective after I've read it and form my own opinions. And I ended up having a greater appreciation for what this book is trying to do. And it weirdly, the slow pace worked better for me in hindsight than it did at the time I was actually reading through it, if that makes sense. Once I really sat with it for a bit, I just grew a greater appreciation for how it was done. As I mentioned, Rey is really dealing with her own personal demons in the aftermath of The Last Jedi. She has all these pressures, and she's kind of thrown all of it into the idea of fixing this Kyber crystal will fix everything for her. Leia, meanwhile, is struggling with her recent and not so recent losses. She's struggling with learning how to be a teacher and struggling with how to form this relationship with Rey, who is learning to become a Jedi from someone who never 100% finished her Jedi training. That's kind of what Leia's going through in this book. These are interesting things to explore, and the setting of the planet Tython just kind of really adds to the excitement of the mystery of this too. Tython might sound familiar to you. I believe it was in The Mandalorian. I think that's where he ends up taking Grogu, if I'm not mistaken. It's this ancient Jedi planet. But Tython has its roots way before Disney had owned Star Wars. It was an important planet in Star Wars Legends. I believe in Star Wars Legends, it was the first planet the Jedi formed on. And it's in the Darth Bane trilogy. It's a planet you can go to in the Old Republic MMO. It's a fun planet, and I'm glad to see it back and explored here a bit. There's kind of these creepy ruins that Rey and Leia are exploring in the book. When it comes to the plot as well, the author did manage to check off items on my list of things that I wanted to see happen in that book. So that was accomplished. That was important to me as a book that kind of feels like it's more meant to be a tie-in or a bridge between movies than necessarily its own thing. So I was glad it did that. Again, though, it just might feel a little slow for you. I mentioned how Tython is a fun setting, but Rey and Leia aren't exploring this temple the whole time. They take breaks, they go out, they talk with these villagers that are there, they kind of do other little things. So again, it's a book that does take its time. This isn't helped by the other half of the plot, which is the story involving the First Order officer, Brilla. Her whole plot, of course, is about trying to discover these attackers that try to take her life, and she does a bit more of the adventuring in the book versus Leia and Rey. She travels to a bit more planets, comes across a bit more danger. Those are things that are really covered in her half of the book. The problem I had was that her story really feels barely related to Rey and Leia's story. So when you combine that with the slow pace of Rey and Leia's story, I just honestly, every time I got to a new chapter and we had switched to Brilla's perspective, I was just waiting until we could get back to Rey and Leia and see what they were doing. So unfortunately, that's a big flaw. Half this book is about Brilla, and again, it wasn't related enough to Rey and Leia that, at least to me, to stick out, and it just wasn't as interesting as what Rey and Leia were going through. So at the end of the day, I did have some pacing issues with this story and how it was told, but it's still at the end of the day, it still ultimately worked for me. All right, so let me talk about the characters next. So let's start with Rey and Leia. The author, she does capture their voices perfectly. She did an amazing job at that. This feels like Rey and Leia when you're reading them. And it's great getting inside of their heads. Other than the pressures I mentioned that Rey is going through, I also like that she's kind of struggling with the interactions she had with Luke in The Last Jedi, and some of the things he said to her still hurt and are still sticking with her. We also get to see some of Rey's thoughts about the Jedi in general, and I couldn't help but think that these were tiny hints of how we're going to see Rey treat her Jedi Order in her upcoming movie. I also got to mention, I really like Rey and C-3PO's relationship in this book. So C-3PO also goes with them. He's kind of helping Rey sort through all of her Jedi book archives and helping her figure out the mysteries of this temple they go to. And I just really like their relationship. She genuinely appreciates him, and he genuinely appreciates being appreciated. And it's kind of nice to see C-3PO interact with someone who does seem to actually care for him. I really like that a lot. It kind of adds more weight to his scene in Rise of Skywalker, where he's going to be erasing his memory and he's kind of taking one last look at his friends. I feel like this book kind of helps add to that scene a bit. You do feel like he's kind of formed a relationship with her, which was nice. Leia comes across as both a very tragic figure and a very aspiring figure. And the author just once again captures all of this perfectly when it comes to her. It's really fun exploring Leia at this time of her life after everything she's gone through. And it's a great way to explore the character in a way that we unfortunately couldn't in Rise of Skywalker due to Carrie Fisher's passing. One of the other major characters is, as I mentioned, his name is Gav. He was one of those rebels that attacked Brilla, not the rebel resistance. He was just a freedom fighter on his planet. He's basically a teacher. He's a kind of a poet, a writer. He's someone who isn't really cut doesn't seem to be cut out for a fighting life, and he's kind of struggling with that a bit. I haven't brought him up much. He's there with Rey most of the time, but honestly, he just didn't leave that big of an impression on me. I found him to be just an okay character, but not someone I was terribly interested in. And at times, I even found him a little annoying. He kind of has this anger towards Rey, and there are times where he doesn't want her around, but he's only with her because he gets himself into the situation where he ends up with her. It's all his fault, and he's only there because of his choosing. So that just kind of made him a little more annoying to me. Again, ultimately, he's a fine character. He just really didn't leave an impression on me either way. Let's talk about Brilla, who's the other half of this book. She is, even though I talk about how, I didn't find her story compared to Rey and Leia's and was kind of unrelated, she is an interesting character. She kind of reminds me of Deidre from Andor. She's a First Order true believer. She was someone who, as a child, willingly joined the First Order. She wasn't kidnapped. This attack on her life has really scared her, and she really wants to figure out who was behind it, and she can't understand why the First Order doesn't necessarily care who is behind it as she goes on this journey. She's definitely a villain. You may not like her, but you understand her, and she's written well. And if this were another book, I think I would have been more interested in the story, but because, again, she's in a book with Rey and Leia, she just can't compare wanting to see what happens to her versus wanting to see what happens to Rey and Leia, unfortunately. Those are the main characters. There are some other characters in this book. Gav has a partner who's much more of an aggressive fighter type, and I think I found him a little bit more interesting than Gav. I mentioned there is a village of kind of these Jedi historians on Tython, and we spent a little bit of time with each of them. One of them is actually who is my favorite non-main character, is a child named Meepka. She was fun because she keeps getting into this mischief and pulling Rey into it. Chewbacca is here, but unfortunately he doesn't do much in this book. He's just kind of there. And the rest of the sequel trilogy main cast, they're not in this. They don't join Rey on this adventure. I do want to bring up Kylo Ren is on the cover of this book. He plays a part in this book, but he is not a main character whatsoever. So don't go into this thinking this is a half Rey story, half Kylo Ren story. That's not the case here. To talk a little bit more about the writing itself of the book, the writing is mostly good. There were occasional instances where I would find a conversation felt a little unnatural or just a little bit off. This mostly happened with the character Gav, so I'm not sure if maybe this is just the way he was deliberately written. Maybe he's supposed to be a little bit more awkward than I was picking up. But it is something I would notice occasionally, that something would just feel off with the dialogue. There's also a very surprisingly dark part that happens in this book that just seems to come out of nowhere. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. That's not a negative, that's not a bad thing. It's just something I noted, and I guess that's kind of this author's thing. That's something that she likes to do. So in summary, just to kind of recap the negatives and positives, I like to start with the negatives so I can end on a positive note. When it comes to the negatives of this book, Gav is, you may find him to not be the most interesting character for a main cast character. You may not care for the other plot half of this book involving Brilla, and she is a full half of this, at least she feels like it, so that is important. There may be the occasional conversation that you find feels a little off. And last, this one's just a potential negative, but this is a slower paced story. I don't want to put that fully as a negative because you might really like how that's handled. It's a potential negative, but it's also a potential positive. It's a slower paced story that lets you really get to sit and explore with these characters and learn more about them. Continuing on that thread of the positives now, Rey and Leia are done perfectly. It's extremely fun getting to get inside their heads and spend time with them. The book does succeed in feeling like a good bridge to Rise of Skywalker, which for me, that's the most important thing that I think this book had to do. It will tick things off your list that I think you're looking for. It may even tick a few things off that you weren't looking for. And the planet Tython does make for a fun setting. Overall, do I recommend Star Wars Legacy? If you are a fan of the Star Wars sequels, if Rey is one of your favorite characters, if you are interested to explore Leia at this stage in her life, then yes, I do recommend this. This book will not disappoint you in that regard. If the sequel trilogy era is not your favorite era, if you like Star Wars books, but again, maybe that era just does not interest you as much, maybe those characters don't interest you as much, this book is not going to change your mind. I think people that enjoy and are more fans of the sequel trilogy will be a little bit more forgiving with the pacing and flaws of this book. So if you fall into that category, you may want to wait for the paperback. But that's it for my first reading impression of Star Wars Legacy. This is the freshest first reading review I've done so far. So if you are reading it, let me know what you are thinking, what you thought, if you plan on picking it up. Just to give another quick update for me, I am just about finished with my Star Wars backlog now. The last books that I finished recently and I have to make a video for are the From a Certain Point of View trilogy of episode 4, 5, and 6. Those have been sitting on my shelf for a while now. I finally got through them. I'm going to make a video on my thoughts on those. After that, I'm almost done with the novelization of Attack of the Clones. I already finished The Phantom Menace, so then I'm going to do full podcast episodes on those as well. But that's it for me. I hope you have a good day. May the Force be with you, and I'll see you in the next video.